Hello, my History 461 students. This is Professor Donald Earl Collins, and it's now week 3 as we move into more into the meat of the course. This week, your readings and your discussion questions are about Jim Crow, the rise of it, the height of it, the violence of it, and the decisions that African Americans had to make in the midst of this rolling tide of white supremacy across the South and parts of what we consider, generally speaking, the Midwest, um, in terms of segregation and exclusion from most elements of mainstream public society in the South, in the mid parts of the Midwest, in general. And so I just want to say a few things about week 2 and then move on to week 3. The theme here is that week 1, everyone did really, really well in defining and identifying and even explaining basic concepts. The questions that you have before you for the remainder of the semester for discussion are historical questions where it's not just about explaining concepts and how they operate, but how they change or morph or are used over time. And so when you deal with a question like the one that gives you hints about different things, like the one, for instance, about black codes as a precursor for Jim Crow laws, well, there's something stuck in between known as Reconstruction. That question is practically begging you to talk a little bit about Reconstruction as sort of a buffer between the period of the black codes, which would have almost immediately returned most of the 4 million freedmen and women to some state of slavery, versus Jim Crow, where because of Reconstruction, I mean, I'm not arguing that this is great by any stretch of the imagination, but some semblance of, well, it's not anywhere near the freedom we expect it to have, and we need to fight for so much more, but it's not slavery. Whatever else you can say about Jim Crow, whatever else you can say about Reconstruction, it's not slavery, right? And so, you can say, oh, it's not that much more. But if you were, since most of you did not live in 1870 or in 1880 or in 1890, it's not really for you to judge how African Americans from that period would have felt, right? Would have, about, their prospects in life. No one's saying that this isn't depressing. No one's saying that Jim Crow isn't trauma-inducing. No one's saying that. But they're not saying that it's literally slavery. You're not going to find too many people writing in 1880 and 1890 that we might as well just be slaves again. They're not writing that, right? They're not saying that because it's not the same. So keep that in mind when you make blanket statements that basically are your judgments of what other people are going through rather than understanding what the people who are writing about this actually are saying about what they're going through. That's why historical context is important. That's not to say that you can't judge things as being wrong. It's just that you're not in their shoes, right? You are not the person going through this. Right? I'm not not arguing that it's, that Jim Crow or debt peonage or going to prison for minor offenses, or really no offenses. It's up to the white supremacist sensibilities of Southern whites, isn't a form of slavery. It's just not generational chattel slavery that existed before. It's not the same. It's not the same. So just as an example. So more historical context is needed in general. So this week, really what we're dealing with is the issue of Jim Crow, the actual rise of it, what it does, um, what it doesn't do, and what African Americans and black folk think to do about it. And the tide of it really is laid in the seeds of the end of Reconstruction in 1877 and the Hayes Compromise, which essentially returns power back to Southern whites who, 10 years isn't a long time, right? It's not a long enough period by any stretch of the imagination for you to get rid of systemic racism. Forget, trying to get to the hearts and minds of Southern whites who, between their lust for power and wealth, and in the case particularly of poorer whites, poverty-stricken whites, hatred toward black folks. So Of course, within a few years, you're seeing a return of, of states amending their constitutions so that black men can't vote. The grandfather clause, meaning if your grandfather was enslaved, then you can't vote yourself. You know, poll taxes, making you pay exorbitant fees for certain things, literacy tests to see if you are more literate than the average Southern white man or woman, in this case, white man, so that you can vote. And by literate, and we're talking like high school level literacy in the 21st century, maybe even college level, right? Being able to name obscure, legal texts kinds of literacy test. If anyone's ever watched the movie Selma, there's a scene where Oprah Winfrey, her character, tries, once again, because she's obviously done this a number of times, to register to vote, and they put an impossible literacy test in front of her in order to pass it, in order to get her, registration to vote in Alabama. So just to give you some idea of what we're talking about here. So anyway, so that's just the right to vote. Everything's obviously segregated. Schools were public schools come into the South segregated because black delegates do even in 1867, 1868. The integration wasn't going to work because that would be violent, and the alternative to segregation was exclusion, and black people needed to learn how to read and write. So there was that. Um, Segregated downtown, segregated shopping, segregated restaurants, segregated movie theaters, where black folk had to sit in balconies, segregated everything, right? Um, it meant that you still had to you had to create separate things for everything. Separate and unequal, to be sure. Black classrooms got hand-me-down books with torn-off covers that were maybe 10 or 15 or 20 years old when they got their hands on them, kinds of things. That went on. Black teachers were basically paid at half the rate that white teachers were. And by the way, if you look at the rates in which white teachers are paid and their textbooks, a lot of those are basically hand-me-downs from schools from richer areas too. So it's not like poor whites are benefiting much more than African Americans. It's just the fact that sometimes the way racism systemically works is that it's not just racism, it's racist and capitalistic at the same time, where you don't provide for poor people, whether they be white or black. you know so just because you have white privilege doesn't mean you have socioeconomic privilege. If you are poor and white, your benefits are most from racism are mostly psychological. They're not necessarily material. They're psychological. What's otherwise known as the psychological wages of whiteness, or psychic wages of whiteness, as W.B. Du Bois writes, which which we'll talk about in a minute. So you're talking about very segregated places in terms of relations with public relations between white folk and black folk throughout the South. Other places like Missouri and Oklahoma, which aren't typically considered southern states, really, although Missouri had slavery for about 40 years. But they still had that going on there. Same thing with West Virginia, which is not technically a southern state, although it was part of a southern state until the start of the Civil War. Same thing, right? You see elements of it even in other parts of the Midwest where maybe you don't have full-fledged Jim Crow segregation, but you knew that there were sundown towns in some parts of Illinois and in other parts of Pennsylvania and other places where you shouldn't be going certain times of the day, particularly after work, that kind of thing. So this is a scary time to live in, and with that scariness is violence. Not literally KKK violence, because the old KKK is actually pretty much defunct by virtue of the enforcement acts and the Union Army activities through the 1860s and early 1870s. But what you have is still the equivalent of small southern towns and large southern cities where the police forces might be, are basically de facto KKK members, right? Turning blind eye to white violence when a black man's being strung up or a black woman's being strung up for being uppity, for speaking their mind, for publishing a newspaper in Ida B. Wells's case before she became Ida B. Wells Barnett, for speaking out against lynching, for having a grocery store in Memphis that's actually prospering. And, because she writes about the fact that two of her friends who had a grocery store that was doing really, really well, right, get lynched. They are lynched. They are killed because of their prosperity, because whites in the town in Memphis were jealous of their prosperity. How dare they make more money than we can make, right? Kind of thing. And so they were lynched over jealousy, just jealousy over their material success, their wealth. Um, and she writes about this, and she can't go to Memphis for a while because her printing press office is sacked, burned down. Her printing press is thrown into a river. And if she had come back to town, she would have been strung up too. So being an activist, even a mild activist like Ida B. Wells was in the 1880s and 1890s in the South, was also a very dangerous activity and can get you lynched too. The most common reason you got lynched, though, was either because of your activism or because of the accusation that you raped a white girl, right? Now, let's, in truth, maybe occasionally some black guy probably did rape a white girl or a white woman. Let's be honest, right? This is a violent society, and all of us are prone to commit some form of violence. But the idea that black equals criminal and violent is so ingrained in the minds and in the laws of the minds of Southern whites, many Northern whites for that matter, and in the laws of Southern society and customs, that even the mere rumor that you were sleeping around with a white woman or a white girl could get you killed, right? And while you can have all the laws in the world you want, doesn't stop people from having sex with each other, as we've figured out over the years. And so any relationship that you would have, particularly as a black male, with anybody, white, let alone a white woman or a white girl, could get you killed. Um, Completely consensual, actual rape, somewhere in between, doesn't matter. I'm not supposed to be with them. And so it could get you killed. And so that's literally one of the big factors in lynching here. So lynching's certainly very much a part of, and it's so random that it scares everybody. That's the thing about lynching in this period, because it's not organized. It's not the Ku Klux Klan coming into town and saying we're going to string up a bunch of black people or going to farms and burning them down. No, this is just random occasional acts of white violence, particularly among poorer and working class whites, sanctioned essentially by white leadership, enforced and sanctioned by police forces and law enforcement in this part of the world, right? And so there's that. And so what to do about it? What do you do about this if you are an activist, a considered race man or leader, and that's the term they used in this period, race men, race women, to deal with these sorts of things? Well, the most common answer is, well, why don't we just leave, right? We just leave the South, move somewhere else, move up north. North wasn't available in this period. Not in term, because if you're going to move, you have to be able to find work where you get, when you get to the other side of things. You have to have family there. That doesn't mean that there weren't African Americans who didn't up and leave for Chicago or New York or Philadelphia or even Washington, D.C., or for that matter, leave for southern cities, right, where there is some degree of safety, because there are black communities in these cities like Birmingham and Montgomery, Alabama, or New Orleans, or or Nolens, for those of you, you know how to say it properly, or Houston or Dallas or Atlanta, of course. Atlanta being a black mecca, even relatively speaking, even in the turn of the 20th century U.S. And the reason is you have to be able to find work. You can't just be unemployed. You have to be able to find work when you get there so that you can house yourself and potentially other family members. You have to have better schools. Those are all criterion. So the first real migration of African Americans you see is not to the north for a variety of reasons, mostly related to who's coming to the U.S. to work in the period between 1870 and 1920, well, really up until about World War One, which is the reason why blacks can't find work up north, because a lot of people from outside the U.S. are taking industrial jobs at steel mills, at meat packing plants, at in coal mines and all other places all throughout the Midwest, all throughout major cities in the United States on the East Coast. And the West Coast is not it's not the way it is today, right? So you were a real maverick if you were a Southern black person. You moved up north to find work, and maybe even brought your family along in the process of doing so. And so those black populations are much smaller in the period before 1914 than they become in the period between 1914 and 1930 or 31, which we'll talk about next week, right? I just want to give you a sense of why people don't move. So then it comes down to, for most historians, it comes down to the arguments of two biracial black men, right? And yes, Booker T. Washington is biracial. His father is white. I know, it's amazing, right? Um, Biracialness comes in all shades. So Booker T. Washington and W.B. Du Bois. Booker T. Washington is the founder of the Tuskegee Institute in 1881, an educator, what many people consider a conservative activist, versus Du Bois, who's this radical activist, who's a scholar, the fourth person in history to earn a PhD at Harvard University who's black, first one to do it in the Department of History, although based on what he actually is, he's basically a historical sociologist. That's what he really is. He's one of the founding fathers of American sociology, more importantly. And so you've got these two men who have very different, what according to historians, have very different ideas of how African Americans can overcome the racism that they face. Booker T. Washington's philosophy is called accommodationalism. It's the idea that if we just work on becoming economically prosperous without agitating for more rights, more civil rights, human dignity types of things, right? Like being able to vote, like the end of segregation, all those like let's stop lynchings, then we'll be okay. Du Bois is like, well, that's not going to work, because if you don't have any political power, you don't have any educational power, really, then what's the point of doing all that if all it takes is a violent mob to strip all of that away? And it's borne out for Du Bois certainly by the 1910s and 20s, when there are all these race riots going on, where white mobs are coming into black sections of cities or in rural areas and burning them to the ground, raping and pillaging and killing black people along the way, right? So Du Bois believes in political agitation and like protesting and the like, to getting the right to vote so that you can secure your economic demands. And point of fact, over time, Du Bois particularly realizes that Booker T. Washington isn't entirely wrong, and he's not entirely right, that you actually need both, right? But the reason why this became such a controversy really doesn't have a lot to do with the two philosophies. Um, in a book by David Lever and Lewis, 2 volume set on Du Bois's life, it's not the only place. I actually have done my own research on this too. Du Bois, after he finished his PhD at Harvard in 1896, is working at what was now known as Clark Atlanta University in Atlanta, and he's looking for work. So he applies for an assistant superintendent of D.C. Public Schools job. Now, D.C. Public Schools, just like other schools south of the Mason-Dixon line, are segregated. And so this assistant superintendent job is essentially for the black divisions of D.C. Public Schools. Right? He applies for this job in 1898-1899 school year. And he's obviously, even at this stage of things, is eminently qualified. PhD from Harvard, yeah, just like we would think about it now, and all the credentials. Has already published a dissertation and a book the urban study of the Philadelphia Negro and all that other stuff. So he's eminently qualified. He's turned down, but it's not because he's not qualified. He's turned down because Booker T. Washington wrote a letter stating that you shouldn't hire this guy because he's essentially too radical to be hired by D.C. public schools. And so, on his word, because of his relative clout as a race person, Du Bois didn't get the job. So they have personal axes to grind against each other. Once Booker T. Washington dies in 1915, Du Bois gradually over time admits that he wasn't entirely right and that he himself was entirely right and Booker T. Washington was entirely wrong around these issues. So you really need to think about, you know, Booker T. Washington's philosophy, economic empowerment, minus the accommodation is something that is useful. And Du Bois's talented 10th and political fight for political power and political rights isn't entirely right either, because it's kind of elitist, kind of excluding, right? But there's a rationale behind it that actually does work, because you do need both. You do need leadership, right? You need leadership. You need leaders who agitate, who fight for different things. But you also need folks who are doing the everyday thing of providing for their families and being self-sufficient, in a segregated society and so on, so that you have a reason to fight for these political rights. You needed to do both. And ultimately, that's what African Americans over time gradually do, is that they end up doing both. So, in thinking about the Jim Crow period, at least the highlights of the Jim Crow period, you need to think about laws and segregation and customs and violence and the random violence that tends to happen around these things, and the ways that African Americans, whether they're highbrow like Du Bois, and for that matter like Booker T. Washington. Let's not pretend that Booker T. Washington isn't highbrow, by the way. He's not a common man, right? Yes, he was born into slavery, but he's not common really by any stretch of the imagination, right? And of course, their colorism is issues here to deal with within all of this too. And then to think about those philosophies as being, two pieces of a puzzle that should have just been together all along, right? On some level. So there's all of that. And then there's the fact that, of course, this is the highlight of high point of white supremacy from a global perspective, in terms of colonization, in terms of ideas around superiority, the eugenics movements taking place in this time. And so within all of that, you've got folks who basically think, well, African Americans didn't make it after Reconstruction. It's their fault because they're inferior to white people, even though you've set things up so that no one can really demonstrate their fullness of who they are as black folk in the white-dominated world and in a white-dominated society. It's, it's what it is, right? Frustrating, disappointing, maddening even. So, that's where we are.